left when I had nothing. I remember the day he left like it was yesterday. Not because he slammed the door, not because he shouted cruel words, but because he didn't. He just walked away. No drama, no goodbye speech, no tears. He simply packed his things, zipped his suitcase, and said, "I can't do this anymore." It was 5 words, but they felt like a sentence, one that would echo in my soul for years. We had been together for 4 years. Through college, through my mother's death, through the failed job applications, through his 2 promotions. But that was the thing, wasn't it? He was climbing. I was sinking. The last few months before he left were a blur of rejection emails, sleepless nights, and takeout containers we couldn't afford. My startup had crashed. My savings had evaporated. I was living off instant noodles and expired hope. And he wore crisp shirts, held coffee from expensive cafes, and always had meetings that were too important to cancel. It started with distance. Then came the silence, and then came Elise, the girl from his gym. She wore heels I couldn't afford and confidence I'd forgotten how to wear. I saw the way he looked at her. I heard the tone in his voice when he spoke about her. Excited, light, curious, the same way he used to talk about me. I confronted him once. He didn't deny it, didn't even flinch. "You're not the same anymore," he said. "You used to have fire. Now, you just drown." That hurt more than the cheating, because it wasn't just betrayal. It was judgment. He didn't leave me because I failed. He left because I was no longer useful to the image he was building. The strong, successful man with the perfect girlfriend. And I was the woman crying on a bathroom floor, holding on to the last thread of self-worth I had. The day after he left, I sat alone in our tiny apartment. No furniture. He took most of it. No food. He emptied the fridge. No future. He walked away with that too. All I had left were bills, a laptop with a cracked screen, and a small notebook where I used to write business ideas. I stared at it for hours. Blank pages, like my life. I thought about calling him, begging him, but no. He left when I had nothing. So he'll never deserve me when I have everything. I didn't know it then. But that was the moment it all began. The rebirth. I got a job the next week, serving coffee at a local cafe. The pay was low, the hours long, but the work was real. Honest. It didn't care about my degrees or my broken heart. Customers didn't know my story. They just saw a quiet girl with tired eyes and a polite smile. But inside, something was growing. Every time I poured coffee for someone who looked important, I imagined myself on the other side of the counter. Every time someone left a tip, I dropped it into a jar labeled Future CEO. The other baristas laughed. I didn't. Because I wasn't waiting for a miracle. I was building one. And while he was off taking selfies with Elise on rooftop bars, I was sketching business plans during my 10-minute breaks. While he traveled to Bali with her, I walked home in the rain with soggy shoes and a burning hunger to prove that I wasn't finished. That I was just getting started. I didn't post about it, didn't tell anyone. This wasn't for show. This was for survival. Because sometimes the best version of you is born not from love, but from loss. And I was ready to rise. Sleepless nights and silent dreams. The nights were the worst. Not because of the memories, not even because of the silence. But because at night, I couldn't pretend anymore. In the daytime, I could smile. I could pour coffee, greet customers, wipe down tables like my heart wasn't still bleeding beneath my apron. But when the cafe lights dimmed and I locked the front door, there was no mask left to wear. I'd walk home. Alone. Always alone. The streets were quiet. My phone never buzzed. And the apartment? Still half empty. Still echoing with the silence that mocked me. I'd lie in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, asking myself questions I didn't want to answer. Was I really that replaceable? Did I ever matter to him? Or was I just the training ground before he moved up? Some nights I'd cry until I passed out. Other nights I'd stare at the ceiling so long I started seeing patterns in the cracks. Like constellations, my own version of stars I could wish upon. But even in the silence, a strange thing was happening inside me. A voice, soft at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder with every night I survived. You are more than how he left you. You are not finished yet. So I started getting up earlier, before the sun. I'd sit at the tiny foldable table I called my office and write down 3 things. One thing I hated about where I was. One thing I could do to make it better. One thing I dreamed of becoming. At first it felt silly, but slowly it became habit. It became hope. And then one morning I added a 4th line. Start something of your own. I didn't know what. Didn't know how. But I knew I didn't want to pour coffee for others forever. So I started reading again. Business books from secondhand stores. Online courses at 2 a.m. TED Talks about failure and success and the long, winding road in between. Every free second became a lesson. Every tip I earned went into that same glass jar, still labeled Future CEO. And still, I told no one. Because this wasn't about proving something to the world. This was about proving something to myself. There was one night around 3 a.m. when I woke up from a dream. I was on stage, in a black suit, hair pulled back, talking to an audience. They were clapping. I couldn't hear the words I was saying, but I remembered the look in my eyes. Confidence, power, peace. It didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like a memory from the future. That same night, I opened my old notebook again, the one with the blank pages. This time I filled them. Idea after idea. Most were terrible, some were ridiculous, but there was one. It was about helping small cafes like the one I worked in. Manage inventory, track tips, automate scheduling. A simple system, built by someone who understood the grind from the inside. It wasn't a billion-dollar idea, but it was mine. And suddenly, those sleepless nights, they weren't just haunted. They were productive. They were the soil where something new was growing, where I was growing. And every time the pain whispered, "You're nothing without him," I whispered back, "Watch me." From rock bottom to first steps. Rock bottom isn't always a loud crash. Sometimes it's quiet. It's the slow realization that no one is coming to save you, that he's not coming back, that the friends who once said, "Call me anytime," don't pick up anymore. It's the moment you stare at your reflection and don't recognize the woman looking back, but you know she's all you've got. That was me. And I had 2 choices. Stay there, broken, or rise, uncertain. So I chose the second, even if it was messy. Even if my knees still shook, even if the pain still whispered at night. I started small. I used my barista job not just to earn money, but to observe. I watched how the cafe manager struggled with schedules, how the owner always forgot to reorder beans, how staff miscommunicated about shifts, leading to chaos. I took notes. Every little frustration, every gap, every waste of time. And I turned them into sketches. Pages of rough wireframes, drawn with a pencil and dream. An app. Simple, for small businesses to make their lives easier. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. After weeks of saving, I bought a used tablet from a pawn shop. I didn't have money to hire a developer. So I Googled, I watched hours of YouTube tutorials on app design. Downloaded free software. Failed. Cried. Tried again. At work, no one knew what I was doing. To them, I was just Clara, the quiet barista who always stayed late, who scribbled in a notebook during breaks, who sometimes stared into space like she saw something others didn't. They didn't know I was building something. I didn't either, to be honest. All I knew was this. I refused to be remembered as the girl who got dumped and disappeared. No, I would be remembered as the woman who rose from the rubble. There was one morning I'll never forget. A customer walked in, mid-30s, sharp suit, tired eyes. He was on a call, stressed, muttering something about employee scheduling. I took a deep breath. "Rough day?" I asked. He laughed bitterly. "You have no idea." I smiled. "Actually, I might." He looked up, intrigued. "Sorry, I overheard," I continued. "I'm working on a tool for small cafes and businesses. Might be helpful." He blinked. "You're... What now?" I pulled out my tablet. It was rough, still buggy, but it worked. I showed him how it logged staff hours, sent shift reminders, calculated tips. He stared at the screen, then at me. "You built this?" I nodded. He handed me his card. "Let's talk." That night I didn't sleep. Not because of heartbreak, not because of tears, but because, for the first time in months, I felt something I thought I'd lost. Possibility. That tiny, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this pain had a purpose. That maybe rock bottom wasn't my ending. It was my beginning. I wrote in my notebook that night, "He left me when I had nothing." But what he didn't know is that nothing was where I started everything. The woman I was becoming, change doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't knock on your door and announce, "Hey, congratulations, you're healed now." It shows up quietly, in how you hold your chin a little higher when you walk into work, in how you say no without apologizing for it, in how you no longer flinch when someone mentions his name. That's how it started for me. Small things. I started choosing clothes that made me feel powerful, not just comfortable. I stopped shrinking myself in rooms where I used to disappear. And I caught myself smiling in the mirror. Not because I was pretending to be okay, but because, for once, I was. My days were still hard. I was still juggling long shifts, late nights coding, and ramen dinners. But something inside me had shifted. I no longer felt like a failure. I felt like a work in progress. And for the first time, I was okay with not having it all figured out, because I had a direction. And that was enough. The man I met at the cafe, the one who gave me his card, he kept his promise. We met over coffee, but this time I wasn't pouring it. I was presenting. He asked tough questions. I answered with confidence I didn't know I had. He tested my logic. I showed him my spreadsheets, my flowcharts, my mock-ups. At the end, he leaned back and said, "You've got something here. It's raw, but it's real." He didn't offer money. He offered mentorship, and that was even better, because I didn't need someone to save me. I just needed someone to say, "I see you." In the weeks that followed, I refined the app, added new features, fixed bugs, tested with real cafe owners in the area. Word started to spread. I wasn't making millions, but I was making momentum. And that, to me, was priceless. But the biggest shift wasn't in my work. It was in how I saw myself. I no longer felt like his ex. I was no longer the girl who'd been left behind, discarded, forgotten. I was becoming a woman who built something out of the wreckage. One evening, after a long day, I found myself walking by a restaurant downtown, and through the window, I saw him, Daniel, with Elise, laughing, toasting wine, smiling the smile that used to be mine. And for a moment, my chest tightened, not out of pain, but out of memory. Because that girl, the one who would have stood outside crying, wondering why she wasn't enough, she didn't live here anymore. I took one last look and walked away. Not because I was weak, but because I didn't need to be seen anymore. I already saw myself. That night, I wrote in my journal, "I'm not the same woman he left, and I'm so proud of that. He walked away from the fire, I walked through it, and now I carry the flame." The business that saved me, I always thought success would feel like applause. Like champagne bottles, handshakes, headlines. But when I made my first real sale, it felt like breathing. Like I could finally take in a full breath without the weight of who I used to be pressing on my chest. It wasn't a big deal, really. Just a small local cafe, a cozy place tucked in a quiet street, run by an older woman named Marcy. She was skeptical at first. "I've been doing this by hand for 20 years, she said, arms crossed. I nodded, smiled. "I know, and you've done it well. I'm just here to make the next 20 a little easier," she chuckled. Smooth talker. I showed her how my app tracked inventory, how it sent alerts when stock was low, how it could schedule shifts without chaos. She tilted her head, intrigued. "You made this?" I nodded. She paused, then said 4 words that changed everything. "Let's give it a try." That night I cried again, but not because I was broken. I cried because someone finally believed in something I built, something that came from me. All those sleepless nights, all the ramen dinners, all the rejection, the abandonment, the heartbreak. It suddenly had meaning. I didn't stop there. I started knocking on doors, introducing myself, not as just Clara, but as Clara, founder of BrewTrack. Yes, that was the name. Simple, coffee-themed, friendly. I built a website, wrote my story, told the truth. I was a barista. I know the grind. This isn't just tech, it's empathy, it's in code. And slowly, people listened. There were days it felt impossible. Bugs in the system, clients who ghosted me, a power outage the day of a big demo. But I kept going, because every time I wanted to quit, I remembered what quitting once cost me. Me. I still worked part-time at the cafe. Not for the money, but because it reminded me where I started. One day, a customer handed me a card. Corporate, fancy. He'd heard about BrewTrack from a friend. "Pitch to us," he said. "We're looking to invest in women-led startups." I smiled. I didn't shake. Because I was ready. The pitch day came. I wore the same secondhand blazer I bought from my first job interview. Not because I couldn't afford better, but because it reminded me that I came from somewhere real. I stood in front of a room full of suits, and I told them my story. Not just the tech, the why. The tears, the empty fridge, the cracked laptop, the man who walked away, the girl who stayed, and how she built something from the ashes. When I finished, there was silence, then applause. Later that night, I got the email. They were in. Not millions, but enough. Enough to hire a developer, to rent an office space, to breathe. I stared at the screen, then whispered to myself, this is what it means to come back. Not with fire and fury, but with focus. With grace, with proof that I was never the problem. I was the answer I'd been waiting for. I walked into the cafe the next morning. Marcy looked up from her counter. Rough night? I smiled. No, the best one in a long time. I clocked in, tied my apron. Because even though I had investors now, I still poured coffee with purpose. Because this cafe, this business, it didn't just save my career, it saved my belief in me. And no one, no man, no heartbreak, no failure could take that away again. Success has a new name. They say success is the best revenge. But for me, success wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about becoming the woman I promised myself I'd be. A year had passed since I launched BrewTrack officially. We had clients in 3 cities. I had a small but solid team, 2 developers, a marketing assistant, and me. Clara, CEO. That word still felt surreal sometimes. But then I'd walk into our co-working space, hear the click of keyboards, the buzz of collaboration, and I'd remember. I built this. From scratch, from pain, from nothing. I was now invited to panels, asked to speak at small business events, even featured in a digital magazine titled Women Who Built from the Ashes. The photo shoot was awkward, but when I saw the headline, I smiled, because they didn't even know the half of it. One Friday afternoon, I sat at my desk reviewing applications for a new operations assistant. We'd grown fast, and I needed someone to help manage the growing complexity. As I scanned through resumes, one name made my fingers freeze. Daniel Whitmore. I blinked. Reread it. No, it couldn't be. But it was. His resume was clean. Too clean. No mention of the time he worked at that fancy marketing agency. Instead, a list of temp jobs, short stints, and one short note. Looking to rebuild my career path with meaningful, mission-driven startups. My heart thudded. I stared at the name. For a moment, all the old feelings tried to crawl back. Pain, disbelief, anger. But they didn't get far. Because this time, I wasn't the girl on the floor. I was the woman at the table. His application had landed on my desk. I didn't say anything to my team. Just flagged the resume for further review. That night, I walked through the city. No destination, just clarity. What did I want? Revenge? Closure? A confrontation? Maybe, maybe not. But I knew one thing. He had to see what he walked away from. Not in rage, not in bitterness, but in undeniable proof. On Monday, we invited him for an interview. He arrived early, still sharp, still charming. But something was different. The light in his eyes was dimmer, the confidence thinner. He sat in the waiting area, checked his watch, smiled politely. Until I walked in, he turned and froze. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came. Hi, Daniel, I said, calm, let's talk. We sat across from each other in the meeting room. Glass walls, quiet tension. I didn't bring up the past. I didn't need to. I asked him standard questions. His experience, his goals. Why BrewTrack? He answered with effort. But his eyes, they never left mine. Finally, he broke the silence. Clara, I didn't know. I mean, this is your company? I tilted my head, smiled gently. Yes, it is. He swallowed hard. I didn't expect this. I nodded. Most people don't expect women they discard to rise, but we do. Silence. Heavy, real. He looked down. I messed up. I leaned in slightly. Yes, you did. But I didn't say it with anger. Just truth. Because in that moment, I saw the gap between us. Not just in status, but in growth. I had healed. He had not. And that was the real difference. At the end of the interview, I stood. He did too. He extended a hand. I looked at it. Then Tiu, gently, deliberately, reached for my notebook instead. "Thank you for your time," I said. "We'll be in touch." And I walked away. Not because I won, but because I didn't need to anymore. The resume that shocked me. 2 days pass. No follow-up email, no calls, no thank you for the opportunity. Just silence. I almost thought he would disappear again, like he used to when things got uncomfortable. But on the 3rd day, he came back. Not through a formal message, not via my assistant. He showed up in person, unannounced. I was in a meeting when my assistant buzzed in. "Clara, there's a man here. He says he knows you. His name is Daniel." My heart didn't skip. It dropped. Not from fear, but from the echo of a past I thought had already faded. I straightened my blazer, smoothed my hands. "Send him in." He walked in holding a coffee. 2, actually. The same way he used to when we were still together. 1 black for him. 1 caramel latte for me. Like nothing had changed, but everything had. "Hey," he said softly, placing the cup on my desk. "Thought you might want one." I didn't touch it. He glanced around the office. "Nice place," he said. "Feels like you." I stayed silent. He shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't come to talk about the job." He added quickly, "I know you won't hire me." I raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you here, Daniel?" He sighed. "Because I saw you. Really saw you. And I realized what I gave up." There it was. The confession. The rewrite of history. The subtle suggestion that maybe, just maybe, there was still something between us. A sliver of what used to be. But he didn't understand. That woman? She was gone. I leaned forward, calm, measured. "You didn't give me up, Daniel. You left me. When I was at my lowest. You didn't just walk away from the relationship. You walked away from the wreckage you helped create." He winced. "I was scared," he whispered. "So was I replied, but I stayed." Silence. He looked at the coffee cup between us. "I'm not here to beg," he said. "Just to say I see it now. You were always more than I made you feel." That hurt more than I expected. Because it was true. I had spent years shrinking so he could shine. And now, I was standing in the light. He stood up. Took a breath. "I hope you're happy." I looked him in the eyes. "I am. And I meant it." He lingered. As if expecting, what? Forgiveness? A second chance? A spark? But all I gave him was kindness. And a door to walk out of. This time I watched him leave. And I didn't cry. That night I sat at my window, city lights blinking like stars too busy to rest. I thought of how far I'd come. From the girl on the bathroom floor, to the woman behind the desk, from invisible to unforgettable. And it hit me. He didn't come back because he missed me. He came back because he finally saw what I became without him. I opened my laptop, wrote a note to my future self. They only come back when you no longer need them. Don't mistake timing for destiny. The interview. The boardroom was cold. Not in temperature, but in tension. Daniel sat across from me, hands folded, trying to look calm. But I could see it. The twitch in his fingers, the subtle bite on his lip. He was nervous. And he should be. Because this wasn't just an interview. It was the first time we had ever been on equal ground. Except we weren't. Not anymore. I had brought in 2 team members to observe. They didn't know our history. To them, he was just another candidate. To me, he was the man who once said, "You used to have fire? Now you just drown." Now I was the one holding fire in my hands. "Walk us through a moment of failure," I asked, voice even. He blinked. There was a time I let a project slip, misjudged a timeline. It cost the team a client. I nodded, scribbled a note. "And what did you learn?" He hesitated, then looked me straight in the eyes. "That you can't walk away when things get hard." There it was. The message buried under the answer. A small offering of regret, gift wrapped in professionalism. I didn't react, just kept going. My team asked technical questions. He answered well. He was smart, he always had been. But there was something missing now. Conviction. Purpose. Then came the last question. I leaned forward, folded my hands. "Why Brew Track?" He swallowed. I believe in the mission. Supporting small businesses, empowering people, building something meaningful. He paused, then added almost like an apology. And maybe deep down, I wanted to work somewhere that reminded me of who I could have been. Silence. Even my team felt it. The tension, the history, the unsaid. I thanked him. Told him we'd follow up. He nodded, stood, and for a moment, I saw the man I once loved. Not the polished version, but the real one. The man who used to whisper dreams at 2 a.m. The man who held me when I broke. The man who, before everything, wanted more for both of us. And for a second, while I just one past, I wondered, would hiring him be a punishment or a kindness? Later that night, I stared at his resume again. He was qualified. He needed this. But so did someone else, another candidate. Younger, eager, full of ideas, no baggage. I had a choice. I drafted the email, sat with it, then deleted it. Instead, I picked up the phone. He answered on the second ring. Clara? My voice was steady. Daniel, thank you for coming in. I wanted to speak to you directly. He held his breath. I'm going with another candidate, I said. It's not personal, it's just the best fit for where we are now. Silence. Then, I understand, he said, voice low. I wish you the best, I added gently. And I meant it, because I didn't need to win by pushing him down. I'd already won by standing on my own. After we hung up, I closed my laptop, looked out at the city I now called mine, and whispered to no one in particular. Let them see me now. Not to show off, not for revenge, but because I'd earned this. Some interviews aren't about hiring, they're about closure. I didn't come to break you. The days after the interview passed quietly. My team moved on. New hires came in, projects kept flowing, but something in me felt unfinished. Not heavy, not angry, just unresolved. It wasn't about Daniel anymore. It was about the version of myself that still lived in some quiet corner of my chest. The version that never got to say goodbye. Not really. One evening, I found myself standing outside the old apartment, our old place. It looked smaller now. Not because it had changed, but because I had. The window that once framed my loneliness now reflected strength. The door that once slammed behind him now felt irrelevant. I didn't cry, but I did close my eyes, take a breath, and whisper, "Thank you for leaving." Because without that moment of collapse, I would have never learned how strong the rebuild could be. A few days later, I received a letter. Not an email, not a text. An actual handwritten letter from Daniel. Clara, I wasn't sure you'd read this, but I needed to write it. I've thought a lot about that interview. About everything. I came in hoping for a job, yes, but also hoping for something else. Maybe a second chance, maybe validation, maybe forgiveness. But sitting across from you, seeing the woman you've become, I realized something. You didn't come to break me. You came to remind me of what I broke. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to say, I see you now, and I hope you never stop building. D. I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. Not because I needed to revisit it, but because it was done. Like a chapter closed, yes, not slammed shut, just gently sealed. That night, I hosted a small team dinner. We toasted our latest client win, laughed over burnt pizza and startup chaos. And for the first time in years, I felt light. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer carrying what wasn't mine to hold. Later, walking home under the city lights, I whispered, he left when I was nothing. But I didn't come back to break him. I came back to prove that I was never broken. I won. Without needing revenge, victory doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just exhales, soft, quiet, like a breath you didn't know you'd been holding for years. I stood backstage at a tech summit I once watched online from a cracked laptop. Now I was the keynote speaker. The banner behind me read, Brew Track, from coffee shops to code. Underneath it, my name, Clara West, founder, CEO, and everything in between. As I stepped up to the mic, I looked out at the crowd. Investors, founders, young women with notebooks like the one I once scribbled in. They didn't know my whole story, but they saw the version that made it here. Strong, polished, resilient. But what they didn't see was just as important. The tears, the nights alone, the coffee I once served instead of pitched. And the man who once said, "You used to have fire. Now you just drown." He was wrong. I didn't drown. I burned. And from the ashes, I rebuilt. After my speech, a girl approached me. Barely 22. Shy, hopeful, tired in the eyes but fierce in the jawline. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated. "How did you forgive the people who doubted you?" I smiled and told her the truth. I stopped needing them to believe in me because I finally believed in myself. That night, I sat alone on my apartment balcony. Different view, different city, but same sky. I opened the drawer, pulled out Daniel's letter, read it one last time. Then, without anger or sadness, I let it go. Literally. I tore it piece by piece and dropped it into the wind. The paper danced, lifted, flew, just like I did. Because this wasn't about him. It never really was. It was about the girl who stayed. The woman who rose. The fire that didn't destroy her, but refined her. And in that moment, as the last shred of paper disappeared into the stars, I whispered, "I won." Not because I crushed him. Not because I proved him wrong. But because I never let him stop me from becoming me. This was never a revenge story. It was a rebirth. Some people leave scars, others leave lessons. Burn and reborn stories that break you, then rebuild you.